Hello, welcome to Bike Social. Welcome to the latest episode of Talking Heads. And you may have guessed, because it doesn't look like our studio, but we're on location today. How exciting. So you joined Steve Rose, BikeSocial's publisher, and I, Michael Mann, here at Yamaha UK for a very special episode with marketing guru, godfather of motorcycling, Jeff Turner. You look at me a bit blank.
That'll do, that's great. Yeah, I'll get my business cards changed straight away for that.
Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. So we're going to get used to or familiar with Jeff and his career. 36 years, did you say?
It is just coming up to 36 years now. Wow, it's Yamaha UK.
What a run, what a chapter. Do you remember your first day?
I do, yeah. And the funny thing is, it's been, and it sounds corny, but it's been so full on from day one that it's almost, I mean, it's flown by, and yet it seems a long time ago. And it was a really different world back then. We had a telex machine in reception. Can you believe that when I started? That was how we communicated with Japan. So yeah, a few things have changed, but essentially, you know, motorcycling and, you know, what we do in marketing and sales for motorcycling, it's still kind of the same, because we're still tapping into that passion that people have to ride bikes.
Yeah. It's wonderful, isn't it? It's still engines and noise and two wheels, and everyone still gets that buzz of excitement, don't they?
Yeah, I still do. You know, you open the garage, you pull out the latest whatever I happen to have, yeah, you just, I want to ride this thing. Yeah. It just feels great.
Well, I was like that. I came in here this morning. The first thing I saw was that black R9 and just went, I want a black R9. And then the second thing I saw was there's an old TZR 250 in the warehouse there. And so I want a TZR 250.
Oh, and that's also, I mean, that's a 40-year-old bike now.
Yeah, I know.
I remember, we'll get into it, but I remember looking after Matt Oxley at the TT in 1986 when he raced one of those. And he won the production 250 TT in 85. And Yamaha took him for 86 to ride that. And we should have won it, actually, but that's another story. But yeah, you forget how long some of these things have been around.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Look, I mean, we're getting distracted already, but you look at the TZR, which I know is a very deliberately pared back minimalist machine, and you look at the kind of like things like the R7 and the sports bikes now, and the bikes today are so much more finished and complete, and just, you know, the TZR looks almost like a Bitzer now, in that you can see there's random fasteners and it's just, it doesn't look like it's as coherently designed and finished as these are.
Yeah, I suppose that's true, really. That you know, but you've got to remember how. I mean, we'll come on to this later about how quickly things were changing in the 80s in terms of the development of the product and the change in technology. And I think you didn't need to focus on details, because 2 years later there was going to be something new that was superseding it. It was a real, you know, race, space race, if you like, in those days, in terms of model development. So those models, they weren't around for very long, but they sold in big numbers. Have we answered all your questions already?
Yeah, because I could just listen. I could sit here and listen to you two talk about motorcycling for the generations. This is brilliant. To try and attempt to have some form of structure to this, should we try and get to know you a little bit more, Jeff? Your background pre-Yamaha, perhaps, and then maybe your role and its development through your Yamaha years. So maybe you can start with your first bike.
So I'm quite old now, as you probably, I'm even older than Steve. I know it's hard to believe on camera, but it's true. So my first bike, I was born into that generation that were using sports 50cc. So FS1E from Yamaha, AP50, SS50 from Honda. Those were the bikes of my generation when I left school. And we all had them. So really my first introduction to motorcycles was sort of at 15, 16. I had an elder brother who was into bikes, so that was kind of where it came from.
Yes.
And as soon as you and all your mates had your 50s, you were off, basically.
Freedom.
Completely freedom. And, it was a different world. So freedom and a little bit of madness as well. And, we would go around riding as a group, a gang, you might even suggest to call it. And, these things only did 49 on a good day downhill with the wind behind you. But it didn't matter. To us, it was biking, and it was so exciting at the time. My very first bike was actually a bike called a Gitane. Champion Veloce. So I won't go into the details, but it was pretty trick for a 50cc. You'll have to go and look it up. I then had a sort of succession of other 50cc bikes. And then, of course, as soon as you're 17, at that age, at that time, you can ride a 250 on L plates, because that was the law. So I had a couple of different bikes. I had an air-cooled Yamaha coffin tank 250, and then a little bit later got a 250 LC. So those were my kind of first Yamahas, and various other things. During those sort of early years, I did some business study and management stuff at college, but after I left college, it was motorcycles. It just had to be motorcycles. I had the bug, it was in the blood, it wasn't going to be anything else. So I took a first job as an apprentice mechanic, actually, to get into a dealership, and I learnt an awful lot there. And in actual fact, dealerships at that time, we were London-based, and a lot of the press and media were also London-based. MCN used to be in East London, sort of Wapping type direction, kind of Fleet Street and a bit. So a lot of London was kind of the centre of biking in terms of media, journalists, and so forth. And we would get journalists who would come into the shop to borrow bikes. The manufacturer had agreed. But equally, some of the bikes, there weren't so big importers for some of the smaller brands. Some of the bikes we would import direct. I then worked for a second dealership called Motor Vecchia, and they were a Cagiva importer and a Motor Marineri importer, and they also had a couple of other franchises. And we would supply press bikes. And at a similar sort of time, I moved to a house, a share with a friend. We used to keep the bikes in the living room, but that's another story. But and around the corner were a couple of guys who were journalists and racers and so forth. So I started getting to know some of the people who were working in the bike magazines at the time, and working in the media and racing and so forth. So that was kind of the early years. I also, after that, worked for an exhaust manufacturer called Motad, which was a UK. Do you remember Motad? Yeah, I thought you would. So they actually built exhaust systems. They were based in East London, and they actually manufactured there. And they had dynos, so they were doing development work and helping with racing and stuff. And after that, I joined Advanced Publishing, which was a publishing company run by a journalist called Mark Williams, who you will have known, who was the guy who invented Bike Magazine in the early 70s. Inspirational writer. I still enjoy reading his stuff. He's the Hunter Thompson of the UK, as far as I'm concerned. And they had a number of titles, including Motorcycle International. Julian Ryder, the commentator from GPs, he was the editor when I went there. And then a guy called Tom Isaac was the editor, all really well known back in the day. And they also had What Bike magazine. So I worked there for a few years. And then it was 1989 and I joined Yamaha, which actually at the time was called Mitsui Machinery Sales, because Yamaha was imported by Mitsui, which was a global banking and trading organization, which helped Japanese companies set up networks in various countries around the world. So there was a Mitsui in UK, there was a Mitsui in Germany and so forth. But over the years, Yamaha have taken over the distribution and the shares of the companies, and we're now a branch of Yamaha Europe. So I joined Yamaha in August 1989.
Blimey.
Wow.
You'd already done so much by then. How old were you in 1989, if you don't mind me asking?
I'd have been, good, that's a tricky question, I'll have to work it out. I'd have been 27. So just starting on that part of my career, really.
So media into a manufacturer?
Yeah, well, I'd kind of done everything by then, really, because I'd been involved in the press, I'd been involved in racing, in the technical level. Obviously, things like digital marketing just didn't exist. We'd have been doing this on celluloid, literally, with a real camera going around. So when I came to Yamaha, I kind of offered them something which was quite unique. So it was all these relationships and contacts in the racing and media world with motorcycle journalists, plus experience of technical. And I still believe that in marketing for motorcycles, you should understand how it works and what it does, because if you get asked those questions by customers or journalists, you should be able to tell them. So I've always made sure I've kept up to date with all the tech and how everything works and so forth, and know the product from, you know, the crankshaft outwards, as it were.
You're a Yamaha encyclopedia.
Yeah, there's probably a few pages which are a bit rusty by now, but yeah, we've seen quite a lot over those 37 years.
Well, you were also involved in Team Bike, weren't you, at one point?
Yeah, so that was an interesting one. So where I lived, a couple of the guys were working in EMAP, as it was then, with Bike Magazine and various other titles. Bike Magazine in those days was probably selling 90,000 a month. You know, this was big. You couldn't go on the internet, and magazines were really where it was at. And there was a couple of guys, a guy called Howard Lees and Dave Chisman, who had got together and worked with a magazine called themselves Team Bike, and they'd been doing proddy racing in the UK in sort of 1980 and 1981 to a reasonable success, club and national level. But as one of their hobbies, they had also been passionate visitors of Le Mans and Paul Ricard and the endurance races, just because it was a thing that was going on then. They decided that they could do it, basically, like you do.
Yeah.
So they took their proddy bike and started to modify it. And over the winter of 81 to 82, they created an endurance team. And they asked me, through the contacts that I knew, whether I wanted to come and help. And of course I said, absolutely. So we did it, you know, it was a voluntary thing. We weren't paid to do it. We were an amateur team. And it was a bit sort of tortoise and hare. We knew we couldn't be faster than a factory bike, but if they made one little slip or trip, we'd be there.
Yeah.
But endurance racing, there's a lot to learn. I mean, one 24-hour race is more racing miles a year than an entire BSB season. So you're doing 2,000 miles in a 24-hour race. It's, you know, there's a lot to consider apart from just speed, and you need a good team behind you. And we had quite a successful start with a good result at Le Mans. So essentially in April 1982, we all jumped on the boat, as it were, and off we went to Le Mans. But the clever part of the thing was an agreement that was set up by some quite foresighted guys. One of our main sponsors was P&O Ferries. Okay, so there's no Channel Tunnel. That didn't come for more than a decade later. So if you wanted to go to France with your car or your bike, you got on a ferry. So we had a deal where we were called Team Bike. So Bike Magazine guaranteed us publicity, win or lose, whatever. It was, we were always going to create a story.
Yeah.
It was that kind of thing. So Bike gave us the space and covered the story. It had something exclusive. P&O Ferries got publicity, and people would then book their P&O ferries through the magazine deal. We had the sponsorship from P&O, and the bikers would come on the ferries to Le Mans or Bordeaux to see us, to the point where over a few years it grew to such a size that P&O had to put extra ferries on. We would have 4,000 bikes coming to Paul Ricard just to see us.
No way.
And we would sell reassuringly expensive T-shirts and things like that just to subsidise the cost of running the team. So everybody was a kind of stakeholder in it, the fans and all the rest of it. And it was the Wild West, Paul Ricard, Bordeaux at that time. It was madness, it was chaos. And Matt Oxley will tell you about going down the straight and not being able to see for 10 seconds, you know, 160 mile an hour because of the campfire smoke, but you could smell the sausages, you know, it was this kind of stuff. So the team evolved from 1982, and I worked with them until 1989 when I joined Yamaha. So in those days, it was a full world championship. It was 8 rounds, and I went from being the kind of junior mechanic to perhaps the senior mechanic. So pit stops, bike preparing, you'd be up all night. And we had some great results. We never won one in that time, but we had a number of podiums, and we beat a number of factory bikes. We had a second at Le Mans, we had a second at Spa, we had a 7th at Suzuka 8 Hour, which was amazing.
Wow.
And it was a full-on championship, but I think you've also got to put it in the context of what was happening in the world, because if you think about things like package holidays and cheap flights, that only came in the 70s. So going to France on your bike was a big thing. You know, it really was big. I remember painting the headlights yellow with a, do you remember that? With a little, you got a little brush and like a nail varnish and painted your headlight yellow because that was the rule in France. And then you had to scrape it off when you got back. But in that context of it, Team Bike was partly responsible for opening up the whole of the touring market to Europe, because we were the people that saying, here's the destination, come with us, join us. And at the same time, the package holiday market was expanding, cheap flights, Freddie Laker Airways, you remember them? All that stuff was going on. And in fact, I'll never forget, we got back on the ferry from that very first Le Mans in 1982, and we're sitting there in the bar having a drink or whatever on the way home, and the newspapers were there. We hadn't seen a newspaper for 10 days, and the front of the newspaper just said, "It's war." So as we were racing in the mall, the Falklands War started. Okay, and we thought, what have you done? We've only been away a week. So, but it was an amazing time. They were amazing people. And I think in the context of the bikes, I always maintained that the 80s that was the golden decade for bike development, and Team Bike reflected it. So we started off in 1982 with air-cooled 4-cylinder, really big thing, tubular steel frame, standard way up forks, 35 millimeter diameter was cutting edge, twin rear shocks, and by the end of the decade we were on gear-driven water-cooled V4s with beam frame and upside-down forks and single-sided swing arms and all kinds of stuff. And just in that decade, if you see the change, it was incredible. And we were always on top of that. And that kind of made it newsworthy as well for Bike Magazine, because we would be given the latest stuff to test. You know, Dymag came to us with their first ever 3-spoke wheel. Of course, now it's everywhere. But, you know, so we ran them and we worked out what worked, because an endurance race is a way of working out what works and what doesn't work very quickly. And Howard Lee's the guy who ran the team. It was his team, really. He was a really good engineer. And the bikes were really good and cleverly done. You have to be clever. You have to have your wits about you. You have to try and stay one step ahead. And we had some great times, and I could rattle about on it for hours, but it was really, really good.
I can imagine the stories, and you can write a book about things like that.
Well, hopefully somebody will one day, because he would be the chief candidate. Matt Oxley was the rider from 83 onwards, more or less, and we had lots of other riders. In fact, without sort of being too big about it, we got pretty good at it. We became the private team to beat. There were some other really good English teams. Phase 1 came sort of a bit later on. Saluki, Roland Brown, who was a Bike Magazine journalist, he's still around. He was racing in another team. So as we got better, we attracted better riders. Howard eventually retired from racing, as did Dave, and ran the team. And we had riders of the quality of Steve Hislop, Kenny Irons. He was a particular favourite. He ended up riding a Pepsi Suzuki Grand Prix bike after riding for Team Bike. Got spotted by Suzuki, got a Grand Prix ride. So we were quite a popular team for people to ride with. And they also had heard that we like to enjoy ourselves as well after the race. So
I'm sure that was part of the attraction. Jeff, did you ever race? Did you ever have a go? Were you at that kind of standard?
It's an interesting question. I dabbled. We used to do club enduro, sort of in the early 80s, and I had an enduro bike, but it was only club level, really. And I still maintain now that riding off-road is really good for your road riding. It teaches you all kinds of throttle control and skills, and the bike moves around and you get used to it. So it's really good for your riding. But I kind of, I love riding on the track, absolutely love it. But I've always worked with top-level international riders, and I've always kind of considered myself not good enough really to race, and perhaps I don't have that cutting, thrusting, aggressive 1% you need to win a race. I'm very happy to to not fall off and hurt myself, and perhaps back it off a degree, not back it on a degree, just to preserve everything. So love track riding, but I never raced as such. No.
I remember an R3 launch. I think you invited me to. What was it? Califat potentially.
It was, yes.
I remember just you were on it and disappeared, showing us the way. It was lovely to see.
Yeah, I do enjoy track riding, and it's just so pure. You don't have to think about all the other stuff. People think it's dangerous, but actually, if you've never tried track ride, it's riding. And you can do it on a Bennett's track day.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's such a pure thing because you don't have to consider side roads and footballs bouncing over hedges and all that other stuff. It's just you and the bike and the apexes and the. So yeah, I'm keen to get it on a track. It's good fun.
Thank you for that nice segue. Yes, Bennett's Track Days. If you've not signed up yet, get yourself on one. There's 5 more, I think, this year. You're going to join us at Brands Hatch, aren't you?
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
What are you riding?
I bought an R1 at the end of last year because the R1 has now not a road bike. It's a homologation bike it's non-homologated, so it's for track use and track day use. So I bought one of the last of the road ones.
You just peeled off the Jonathan Ray sticker, have you?
Well, funnily enough, actually, the last guy to rattle around it, and it was Brad Ray. So I lent it to him as a training bike because he needed a few miles, and that worked out pretty good, didn't it?
Yeah, he's done all right for himself, hasn't he?
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting what you said a few minutes ago about how bikes developed in the 80s and that period where it all went so fast. Because that, for me, Yamaha has always been one of those manufacturers that isn't afraid to try new things. And some of them work, some of them don't. That's the nature of how it works.
Course,
but Yamaha have had a succession of bikes that are, that are different, innovative for whatever reason. And actually, one of those sort of appeared right in the middle of the 80s. And for me, summed up, it was both the last of the old era of superbikes and the first of the new era. And I'm talking about the VMAX, the original VMAX, which doesn't necessarily stand out as one of those. But it was everything about those late 70s superbikes, big, heavy, fast, straight line, and just that kind of, just let's go for it and see how fast this thing will go. But at the same time, it had some quite clever technology in it, in that V-boost thing. It was Yamaha saying, here's a new way of looking at this problem. And we think this works. And it worked really well on that bike and then never appeared on any other bike ever again.
The engine was used in a couple of other things because obviously the VMAX as a specific model was more US focused.
Yeah.
And the engine appeared as a base engine on a couple of other things.
It was in their Taurus, wasn't it?
Yeah, they had a big 1300 Tourer and then also the Royal Star, which was a cruiser type bike that came a little bit later, early 90s. So they used that base engine, that V4, but it was a big old lump. Riding a VMAX with Spirit, I don't know if you've ever done it. It's quite a handful, I have to say.
Yeah, but it's memorable.
It is memorable, yeah, for sure. Yeah. But in those days, shaft drive bikes, and this was true of a whole load of different bikes, XS 750s, if you're looking at Yamahas, or XS 850s, Moto Guzzi Le Mans, Mark 1s and Mark 2s. A lot of bikes with early shaft drive would load the suspension. So as you get on the gas, the torque of the engine went direct to the rear wheel, and often it would rise. And the VMAX did that a lot. The suspension was a little bit crude back in those days. And riding it, especially in the wet, was it was a handful for sure. But goodness me, when the V-boost opened and it took off, it was like a 4-stroke with a 2-stroke power band in a way, because it all came at once.
Right.
And I think if I remember right, the V-boost did not fed 2 carbs into one cylinder. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So it connected the carbs, if I remember the technology right. Yeah. Never a massive seller, a big cult following, but never a massive seller in Europe, to be honest. Yeah. Quite successful in France, but not so many of the other countries.
Yeah. And again, it was one of those, even thinking back before that, I guess with Yamaha you had the LCs at the beginning of the 80s, which were the first bike that really sort of seemed to focus on the package. It wasn't just all about the engine. It had a good amount of power, but it was in a very lightweight modern chassis. And then you had the FZ 750 with the 5 valves. And there's this succession of bikes from Yamaha that were very different from every other manufacturer at the time, who seemed to evolve gently. Maybe Honda in the early 80s, perhaps. again.
Yeah, absolutely. I owned both an LC 250 actually and a brand new FZ 750 in 1986. Both of them, in their own way, were streets ahead of everything else.
Yeah.
I mean, the LC was the answer to a succession of air-cooled 250 twins, which were essentially built for that learner market. So if you didn't have a 100-mile-an-hour 250 when you were 17, then it's hardly worth turning up at the pub. So that market evolved, and Suzuki came with something called an X7, which had 3 miles an hour faster than a Yamaha, and that was kind of how it was. And then Yamaha came with the LC, and it was just like, throw everything else away. This is what everybody has. And there was so many of them back in the day. And of course, the racing, which was an inspirational, the Pro-Am race that you just couldn't do it now. People talk about it. And of course, we had the R6 Cup in the noughties. But to do Pro-Am, it's almost impossible now with contracts and this, that, and the other. But yeah, what a thing that was. And national TV, it went out on World of Sport with Dickie Davies, I think it was, in the 80s. But then Yamaha's 4-strokes, I mean, obviously we pinned as a company and a brand in the 70s and 80s, we pinned everything on 2-stroke. We had some really successful race bikes. And of course, that ended up with V4s. Barry Sheen rode one. Kenny Roberts, of course, 3 times champion. If you go back a little bit before, TZ 750s and 350s and 250s and so forth, and the World Championships as it was then. But we were perhaps a little bit behind on 4-stroke development. So we'd had things like XS 650, which was essentially a copy of a traditional twin. Then overnight, FZ 750 appeared. And we went from kind of there to there on 4-stroke development. You know, it was forward canted engine, downdraft carburetors, 5-valve cylinder heads. It was just an astonishing bike, but perhaps we were a little conservative with the styling because the competitor at the time was a GSXR 750, which everybody remembers with rose tinted specs. But actually, and I'm not just saying it, the FZ was a far better package as a bike. The engine was indestructible, so powerful. And in fact, Team Bike, going back to Team Bike, we had FZ 750 based race bikes in 86 and 87 because it was one of those things that Yamaha did that was a game changer. So in 1985 at the Suzuka 8-hour endurance race, they wheeled out the Tech 21 bike, persuaded Kenny Roberts to come and ride it, and it was the first bike with an aluminium beam frame. Actually, the bike expired about 7.5 hours in, but Kenny had never ridden a 4-stroke on tarmac, turned up and put this thing on pole position at Suzuka in front of Wayne Gardner, Mick Doohan, all kinds of other people. And the bike was just amazing. So in 86, but it was a factory bike, in 86, Harris, because we worked very closely as a team with Harris Performance, Steve Harris, Steve Bayford, and Lester Harris, they built us a UK copy of this Suzuka 8-hour bike. So we had a Harris beam frame bike that we were racing in the World Championship based on the factory bike and everything we could see, and we helped them develop that. So it was a great little story. But that bike from 1985, that was a game changer because the evolution of the frame had been tubular steel frames like cradle, double cradle. Yeah. You could kind of trace it back to feather beds and all that. And then aluminium was the thing to have. So people just copied the same design, but in aluminium. Yeah. So they were double cradle frames, but just made out of box section aluminium, and they weren't great. And then Yamaha turned up with this beam frame, and which then became the Delta box, which is now 40 years old.
Wow. And still used.
Yeah. And of course now everybody has it, and they copied it. So yeah, that was a big tick. But FZ 750, more than VMAX in my heart, it was a really amazing bike.
And then 1989, when you arrived at Yamaha, we were just saying earlier, this was your first launch, is that right?
Yeah, this one isn't there by chance because I have a really soft spot for it. This is the Super Tenere XTZ 750. And when I arrived at Yamaha Mitsui in August 89, my first job was to take a customer trip on this. This was the brand new model. The press event had just happened. And I took a customer trip as part of a sales promotion and we rode from the pyramids out through the Western Sahara, down to Luxor, across to Hurghada and the Red Sea, and back up to Cairo as a promotional thing. I took a journalist with me as well, and yeah, we had a lot of fun hitting the sand dunes with these. At the same time that the Pharaohs Rally was running, so we started off from the pyramids at the same time as Peter Hansel started on his race bike, and they went off into the deep deserts, and we rode the trails. They still beat us to the bivouac in the desert. Yeah. But yeah, I have a very fond spot with that, and it was an amazing bike and an amazing engine, to the point where everyone talks about the R1 1998 model
Yes.
as being the first Yamaha with a stacked gearbox. Well, actually, this was a decade earlier and had a stacked gearbox. So really revolutionary engine, which was a bit the same as FZ 750. It was kind of overlooked. When you bring so much technology in one bike, sometimes the market doesn't pick up on everything. And you focus on the dynamics of it, not the engineering, but some super clever guys at Yamaha Japan who come up with this stuff.
The thing also is interesting because as a market, we were still so focused on sports bikes at that time. Because I remember when this came out, I remember reading the press reports of it, but because the kind of bike it was didn't inspire me as much as an FZR did in those days, I glossed over a lot of technology. I kind of read through it and went, that's interesting, and it kind of got filed somewhere, but I didn't really take note of how much.
Do you know what? I think that's because we're
was.
Brits.
Yeah.
Because actually this was a really big seller in France,
Yeah.
Germany, Italy, and Spain. But the Brits were just, I think it's our racing history and so forth, and the market where we're so focused. Because obviously at that time, things like FZ 600, FZR 400 came a little bit later. But, you know, it was all about sports bikes for us, and racing and so forth.
Yeah.
So yeah, it did, I think in UK, get overlooked.
But when you look at it now, when you look at it again, it's just such a
It's
beautiful
holding
thing.
up it's holding up better than I am at 37 years in. So no, it's good.
Yeah, and it's just, and it, you know, it does look out of place in a way because things like the twin headlights are dated massively now. But actually, it still looks aggressive and imposing, and it still looks cool, doesn't it? And it doesn't look over, you know, it doesn't look engineered like something out of the early 80s. Like you said before, it's that 1989 thing. It shows just how far bikes had developed since 1981.
I find it fascinating that which bikes, not just Yamahas, but which bikes stand the test of time and which bikes immediately look old, or which bikes perhaps, and I think Yamaha has done this a number of times, which bikes perhaps were a little bit ahead of their time. I mean, if we're talking things like GTS 1000, so single-sided front swing arm and rear swing arm, Omega frame is what we called it, with a FZR 1000 engine in it, maybe a bit ahead of its time. So just didn't quite hit that. And you know, a new bike and a new model, and especially a new design, has to be a success. Otherwise, it's really hard to get that success later in terms of marketing. You've got to have that initial bang and that initial demand.
Yeah, and again, misunderstood because I remember riding one, probably I used one 5 or 6 years after it came out, when it's probably been, I don't think it was still available new at that point. But I remember riding it and just being really impressed with that there were certain things that it did that fixed problems that other bikes had. And the one thing I really remember going too fast into a wet roundabout. We've all done it. And having that moment where even though you know better, you pull on the brakes, you try and steer, and it went round with no fuss at all. And I remember, you know, any other bike I can think of in that circumstance, I would have been either lucky to stay on, or it would have been one of those kind of things. And yet that was just like, and done.
Yeah, we didn't sell enormous numbers in the UK, but what it did do is it gave us a base for our Paris-Dakar racing. So that bike eventually became, in the mid-90s, it became the base of Peter Hansel's twin-cylinder bike, where he won the Paris-Dakar a number of times in a row, a full-on factory effort, really. So when we needed this twin, because when the singles that we had XT 500 based, then XT 600 and 660 singles, when they weren't fast enough to win a Dakar because people were coming with twins, then this was one of the reasons Yamaha pursued this and developed this.
Yeah. And there was a 4-cylinder version. There was a 4-cylinder Dakar racer, wasn't
There
there?
was, and funnily enough, it fits into that timeline. So we won the first 2 Dakars in 79, 80 on XT500 based, and then it became more difficult. And then BMW actually came with a twin and were really successful mid-80s. And we were like, oh, we need a faster bike here. What are we going to do? So the French guys took an FZ750 engine, brought it out to 920, fitted all the Formula One cams and everything they could. This was like 140 horsepower, but it was a big old bus. It was wide. It was a bit like a snowplow going through the sand. But goodness me, like the VMAX, it absolutely flew. And they raced that for a couple of years, and there's a few around. But it was very much a stopgap prototype between the singles and this arriving to allow us to be sort of competitive. But it wasn't super successful. But when you see it, what a bike.
Did that ever become a production machine?
No.
I was going to say, I must have missed that one.
Yeah, probably just as well, actually.
But it's interesting because if you look at now, if you think of there are bikes that are sort of styled as semi-adventure bikes, that have got 140 horsepower plus now, aren't they? A four-cylinder adventure styled or upright bike at least has almost become, it's a sports tourer.
But this is where in modern electronics means that you can manage that.
Yeah.
Back in the day, you had to manage performance with mechanical systems. So the chassis geometry was also to do with, will it wheelie too easily? Will it have grip? You can do a lot of that electronically now.
Yeah.
Which actually I think gives the chassis designers a little bit more freedom in terms of where they go with things, because you can just change the electronics and that will make the bike more rideable or better performance or whatever.
Yeah. And I remember you said, we were talking a few months ago about the R9. I remember you saying that the kind of the ethos, the kind of principles of designing these bikes has changed a bit now, and that rather than just go all out for more and more power, the manufacturers are now saying, well, actually, the amount of power we've got is enough. Let's work on the chassis and the electronics and the systems to make the bike more enjoyable to ride.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think probably one of the bikes that changed the market was the 2015 R1 by bringing a 6-axis IMU and all the different things. And even the Japanese engineers at the time were saying, one of the reasons we can make this bike essentially a race bike is that we can control it on the electronics. So, because if we switch it all off, it's unrideable for most people on the road. So if you go back to the original R1 of 98, they didn't have the electronics. So to stop it wheeling, they made a stacked gearbox and a short engine because that would allow them to put a long swing arm on it. And a long swing arm makes the back controllable under the power. So it was very light and it was quite powerful. So that's how electronics have kind of shaped things. And the new R9, it has all the electronics, that you could think of, a 6-axis IMU. The bike brain knows what the bike is doing, what's going on, what the traction is like, and so forth. But it doesn't detract from the riding. And I know a lot of people say, electronics and stuff. Yeah. To me, it just makes the riding more pure because you can set it with a little safety net under you. But performance-wise, it's nearly 120 horse. That's plenty for the road for most of the time. And I think what we as riders probably don't realise with each generation is how subtly much better these things get with every new model. And I had just that experience last year on the latest MT-09. It's the first bike for a long while where I was trying to do a photo shoot in winter, where cold tyres, less grip, cold roads, slightly damp, and photo shoot riding is a little bit exaggerated anyway because you're trying to make things look as good as you can. But I remember on that really feeling the electronics come in at certain points, but in a way that was just really reassuring. So it wasn't detracting from anything at all. It was allowing me to put as much input in as I wanted and I felt comfortable with, and just feeling that little safety net every now and then. The Yamaha engineers, they're real riders. They're really, really clever. I'll give you an example. A lot of these bikes, like the R9, they have lift control. That's what we call it. A lot of people call it, it's anti-wheelie. It's not anti-wheelie at all. Lift control is the brain of the bike measuring and understanding how quickly the front wheel is coming up. We don't want to stop people doing wheelies because there are certain times, especially on a track, where a light front wheel is an advantage. So you can actually set it so it comes up quickly or really slowly, and that allows different riders to either move weight forward or control it on the throttle or whatever. It's not stopping you wheeling in any way, it's just making it more rider friendly. And that is, and to do that without you being able to really feel it, that's clever. That's proper clever.
The R9 is a really good example of if you were to strip it off a little bit and offer a lot of modern day riders an opportunity to have a little look around of it, you'd just see a plethora of wires and leads, wouldn't you? And it's sort of understanding, or it gives us an understanding of how complex these machines are. You know, an R9 versus an R1 perhaps is less complex, would you probably say?
They're pretty much the same, actually. The systems, there's slightly less adjustability on the R9, but the basic systems are pretty much identical.
And then does that then come across from the super sports platform across to your adventure bike platform, the naked platform, and specifically the MTs? So underneath it all, is it similar?
Yes, very much so. And we, for something like a Tracer 9 or an MT9, you would need less functionality. You don't need to fine tune it in the same way as a track bike, where you're always going around the same corner at the same time with the same conditions. You know, by definition, a road bike that you're going from A to B, you're not experiencing that corner in the same way at the same time over and over and over again. So you don't need that real fine tuning, but the functionality is there. And all of this stuff goes back to proper GP technology. So if you look at the M1 of about 2012, the sort of Lorenzo Rossi period, that was when we developed our own system. So the GP bike had the IMU on it. And the only big difference between the final system they ended up with and the road bikes is that they could have a different map for every corner. So the bike would know, you're not allowed to use GPS, but the bike would know where it was on the circuit because it knew where it started and it knew when you put the brakes on, and therefore first corner map goes in, then second corner map, then third corner map, etc., etc. In fact, I'll give you a great example because Lorenzo, I think he was testing at Mugello, and he went out and they'd fiddled with the suspension or they'd done something, and he went out and they'd gone the wrong way and it didn't suit him, and he immediately knew, these guys are amazing, he immediately knew it was worse, not better, so they would go the other way. So instead of doing the full lap, he cut in on the back road back to the pits. They adjusted the suspension in the opposite way and off he went. He came back in the next lap and said, what's happened? The bike's all over the place. And the bike didn't know he'd taken a shortcut. So he was going into corner 1 and the bike was putting on corner 8 map. And that's so it's really interesting, this stuff. But it is a direct descendant of that MotoGP technology of maybe 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, which is interesting because, because a lot of us, it's easy to think now that now we don't ride sports bikes as much as we used to, that there isn't as much benefit coming down from MotoGP, for example. But actually, it's still... The benefits are still coming, they're perhaps just not as
racing is still, in this world, far more than Formula One or anything like that. Racing is still providing direct development for bikes that we're riding, whether they're super sport or street or whatever they may be, touring. Things that are tested and work on track do still find their way to production bikes.
I was hoping we could be able to map my commute to work. Maybe get to roundabout 3 and the big, the slightly grippier tarmac.
Well, if you can guarantee the same weather every time, so.
Yeah. That is the challenge, isn't it, I think, in a way, because you get technology developed from that. And I think I never know whether we should call it semi-active suspension, but electronic suspension certainly is, I think a lot of riders, myself included, when that first appeared, thought this was going to be something that kind of predicts what, and adjusts, but on a road ride, it can never predict what's coming next. I guess it can say you've been riding on these kind of surfaces for this distance.
Yeah, I've just done a big ride on the latest Tracer 9 GT, and honestly, it's remarkable. You can we had a load of motorway miles to do. We had a big distance to cover. We had a load of motorway miles, but we knew ultimately we were going to end up on a couple of alpine passes and some really nice roads. and you can just press 3 or 4 buttons and make an armchair on the motorway, press them again, and make a fairly sharp sports bike for the hills. You know, the suspension suddenly stiffens up, the throttle response stiffens. You need just a few different functions, and electronically you can make the bike feel so different. I'm not sure that everybody uses all that functionality. I think that's maybe an issue we've got, is how to show people how to use it. But honestly, this latest generation of bikes, the GT and the GT Plus Tracer 9, it's amazing what you can do, and what the bike will do for you to allow you to focus on just the enjoyment of riding it.
Yeah, and it does make such a difference when you spend the time looking into the settings and working out. Even if you don't use all of it, you can, as an average rider, you can tell the difference. I think it's really is noticeable.
It's interesting. I wonder how many GT9 riders, Tracer 9 GT riders, there are out there who don't understand it or have never used. I guess it actually goes for all motorcyclists of modern day machinery. There's so many buttons, so many options, so many things one could do, but whether they just don't understand or they're not given the tutoring, the
I
teachings.
remember there's about, I can't remember, 2021. Me and you did a video with the MT-09, I think, when it had the list, and we just went down to Newlands Corner, and Jeff talked through all the functions to set it up, and that video has had, I can't remember, tens of thousands of views, and lots of lovely comments from people who've said just that. And equally, I remember, I think it was when that 2015 R1 came out, I remember at the bike show, you spent about 20 minutes talking me through all the functions, and when you get someone who knows what they're doing talking you through it, it becomes really, really easy, and you just think, yeah, I get it now. It's that somehow. It's how do you, I guess, how do you as a manufacturer, how do you impart that information to customers?
Yeah, and I think, and certainly some of these technologies and the electronics. So we've just introduced YAMT, as you will know from your riding. So this is a new automated manual transmission on the gearbox. So you can allow the bike to be fully auto, or you can shift it on buttons. And the press launch we went to, bear in mind, journalists are pretty well informed and have to be, because that's your job. We sat in the car park outside the hotel, and I had 8 journalists looking at me saying, "So how do I start it?" Because the bike might be in gear, you have to pull a brake on, essentially. Yeah. It's common sense, actually, when you think about it, but no one had told them. We kind of just assumed they might have actually,
read the press back.
Yeah, who knows? And everyone, I said, right, just do this and press that and off you go. So sometimes technology you have to be careful. It can worry people that, why do I need it? But if you can get over that and show them how to use it, it's amazing. The AMT system is amazing. But you're always going to have people going, I can use a clutch, I don't need it. But you can't stand still, because I find one of the most fascinating parts of the job, is when we deal with the product planners.
Yeah.
There are guys sitting in Japan, super clever guys, who are planning what you're going to be riding in 2030. You don't know what you're going to be riding, and we don't know what we're going to be riding, but they have to, because the gestation period for a new model can be 5 years.
Yeah.
And so what is the competition going to be like? What is the market going to be like? What are the regulations going to be like? What is the riders, what do they really want? What are the trends? What are the directions? Or do we follow a trend, or do we start a trend? I think they're the most incredible guys, and whenever I talk with them and meet them, they're inspirational, because they are also motorcycles at heart. You couldn't do that job without having this passion, but also this understanding of engineering, economics, because you can build whatever you like, but if no one can afford to buy it, it doesn't, it's just glory for glory's sake. So, it's such an interesting role within a manufacturer.
I'd love to have been in that office one day, or that meeting room, when someone said, I know, let's do away with the clutch lever. We'll make it all automatic.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because there was apparently a big discussion about, do we leave the clutch lever and gear lever? But then they said, then you haven't got the courage of your convictions. If you think an auto box, bear in mind that even on manual, you press that button, it shifts gear in 0.1 of a second. It's faster than you can do with your foot. So the fact that all you have to do is move your thumb, instead of put your foot under there and pull it up and put your foot back on the peg. So there's less muscles, there's less energy, there's less this, there's less that. And it's faster, it's better. So why would we put a gear lever on it and a clutch lever if we 100% believe that this system is the future and it's better? So they went for it and they took them off, and you sit there. And funnily enough, you don't sit there going, "Oh, where's the clutch?"
No,
but when you get back on a clutch bike, you go, "Oh no, have I got to pull that thing?"
Well, that extra effort.
Well, I had just because I've been riding the MT-07 and I had the AMT bike a couple of weeks ago and then swapped it for the standard one. And the kind of last ride I did, I made sure that I did a really nice ride back on the auto, and then rode exactly the same road out of here, kind of going back on myself on the manual. And hand on heart, and I've ridden that system before on the MT-09, but I think the AMT system on a twisty road, on that kind of, you know, pure biking, if you like, rather than just a functional commuter thing, which it is good for. Yeah. But that kind of a twisty road, which is the measure, I prefer it. I like that whole thing about just changing with your fingers, and it does take a little bit of time to get used to. But I also think as motorcyclists, if we can't get our heads around doing something slightly different, then we probably shouldn't be trying to control something that makes, you know, that much power and goes that quickly in traffic. It's not difficult. It's just having an open mind.
Yeah. We don't follow the automotive trends, but certainly most cars these days will have a paddle shift and an auto-type box.
Yeah.
And when you have been driving one for ages and you get back in like I did, into my daughter's little putt thing, I thought, oh goodness me, have I got to do that? And I thought, what is all this about?
I drove the Bennett's van today. It's a manual. You're thinking, well, that's all this about. This is a bit too much like hard work.
So some of it is what you get used to. But for the engineers and the designers to be able to imagine, conceive where that will be in 4 or 5 years' time, it's interesting.
Does the reverse work? Do those product planners, I mean, you mentioned earlier already that they're taking into consideration, you know, market trends and styles and all the rest of it, but how much of that do you feed back in from the UK operation of Yamaha? And presumably that's come from, or part B of the question is that may well have come from media or customer feedback.
Yeah, I think that, you know, they, especially as it's easy now with everything obviously available online, they do look very much at what the media is saying and what customers are saying. I worked with the European side of product planning a little bit in the mid-90s, mostly detail stuff, not the original zero to concept to production. That's the really interesting part. Then there's sort of sub parts which is like colouring for the markets and little detail changes, and do we need adjustable suspension on this, or do we want the cheaper version which is non-adjustable? You know, how many customers will adjust it, etc., etc. What are the competitors doing? So there's all those kind of things to consider. Things move on and change, and priorities change. You know, it could be that a lot of engineering focus, for example, recently has been to do with the new emission standard EU5+, and making sure your bikes hit that. So we don't want to lose performance if we can. So there's a lot of work that goes on in the factory to do that. But also, you may have seen on a few of our bikes, we now have some acoustic grills on the top of tanks. So how to still engage the rider. So that's feeding him intake noise, because the regulations are all focused around exhaust noise. So, you know, there's the engineer's challenge is to produce, obviously we produce bikes that fit the regulations, and the engineer's challenge is and that's only ever going to be a one-way street. They're only, you know, no one's going to turn around and say, right, let's go dirtier and louder. So it's only going to be quieter and more efficient. So how do you still make your product something that is emotive and that the rider enjoys, you know, that visceral feeling of riding your bike? You know, that's got to be fundamental to it.
I'd love to be in that same office back in Japan and rummage through the bin in there to see which projects didn't make it.
Well, there's been a few famous ones that didn't make it, but you know, I think you touched on it earlier in terms of Yamaha being slightly different, perhaps. We use a company called GK Design, who've always designed Yamaha bikes out of house. So a lot of the styling is done out of house. Now that's very unusual for Japanese bikes, but it allows us to have a kind of, you know, you'll have your own opinions about looks of each individual model stuff, but it allows us to have a free thinking design company actually come up with these ideas. I mean, for example, you go back to your VMAX. The guy who designed that VMAX in 1980, whatever it was, he was the same guy that designed the very famous soy sauce bottle that sort of comes around and has that flat cap, you know, and that was an award-winning, you know, that's the soy sauce bottle. So to have a design house coming up with the styling outside of the conflicts and constrictions of the engineering guys saying, you can't do that, that's a really great place to start. We really want it to look like this, not this is what we can make, but this is what we want to make. How do we make it?
Yeah.
And we have a big R&D base still in North Italy, in the complex in Milan. So we're doing quite a lot of design. So the new Tracer 7 and Tracer 7 GT that we've just announced a week or so ago, that was designed and styled and developed purely in Europe.
Should we talk about racing? Because I know you, as well as all the road bike stuff, you've got a big involvement and have had a big involvement in Yamaha UK's racing for many years.
Yeah, obviously I came to Yamaha UK with 10 years of experience in racing and 8 years on the endurance scene with Team Bike. So that knowledge was very useful. My original role here was as a marketing coordinator and racing coordinator. So I very much looked after our racing interests, albeit that the way that we organise racing was with a team manager, owner. So when I started, Steve Parrish was the team manager, and it was Loctite Yamaha.
Yeah, I remember that.
And
Terry Reimer.
Terry Reimer, yeah. So Terry was an absolutely amazing rider, tall guy. So I had to ride really hard always to overcome a little bit of extra weight and size. And he was spotted anyway on Yamaha in sort of mid-80s when he raced FZ 750 as a privateer and was mixing it up with the front guys. Yeah. So he was racing Loctite Yamaha. Do you know he's the first British rider to win a World Superbike race? There you go. That's a knowledge fact. Yeah. In New Zealand, Mansfield Park, I think it was called. Yeah. Anyway, that was a UK team. Steve ran it. Terry was the rider, and a number of other riders around that time. And then things moved on and changed. Rob Mack joined the team, so came from his Grand Prix career where he'd raced all sorts of things, including Mulberry Yamaha. He was an unbelievably talented, naturally talented rider. Anybody that can ride a trials bike to a super high level and win a TT and win a British Championship, he could do it all. And Rob then rode with Terry that year, and then so Terry won the British Championship on our bike in, I guess, 89, was 90, and then Rob won it the following year, and then Steve went off to do other things, truck racing and other bits and pieces, and Rob became the team manager and owner. And Rob raced for a few more years, so that was kind of early 90s. And we were doing some TT stuff as well. We had a number of TT riders, and in 91 or 92 we had the Carl Fogarty rode our Loctite TT bike, 92 it would have been. And then, of course, YZF 750 happened. So Loctite actually became Fast Orange because it was the same company. So Fast Orange was the Loctite product going against Swarfiga. Was their hand cleaning for workshop guys. So the bikes were branded. We had a brand new YZF 750, which was a fantastic piece of kit and was kind of the next generation after the FZRs. So we'd had FZR 750R, FZR 1000, FZR 1000X up, and then the next generation was YZF 750. Again, an amazing bike, but perhaps as a road bike, we were eclipsed that year by Honda's CBR 900 coming out, whereas we'd made a bike for the World Championship rules because there was Formula One base, 750 base, and World Superbike was just starting. So we had a 750, they had a 900, and that was kind of where the customer focus went. But as a racing bike, what a bike. Whittam, we signed Whittam that year. So Whittam and Rob Mack rode on the Fast Orange bikes, and Whittam just absolutely took to it like a duck to water. It was 2 British Championships that year. There was like an ACU and a Shell, so he was a double British champion that year on the YZF 750. So that then went on, and I was heavily involved in that and the sponsorship, but then the Loctite sponsorship finished at the end of '94. And we kind of had a fallow year in '95 where we did a few bits and pieces with some people. And then I was part of securing the Cadbury sponsorship. Rob Mack secured the ex-Pirovano Belgada World Superbike YZF 750, so factory bikes. So we had this amazing sponsor in Cadbury's. We had the best bikes on the grid, and we managed, or Rob managed, to secure the services of Neil Mackenzie and Jamie Whittam again. Jamie just coming back from his cancers, treatments and so forth. The rest is history, 96, 97, 98, 3 British championships and 3 runner-ups, 1, 2 in each year. And we worked very closely with the team, and it was massive. And the Cadbury thing was great to have a non-trade sponsor, if you like, a proper outside company. We used to go around the circuits and drop off boxes of Boost bars at the Marshall posts, and kind of all sorts of stuff was going on. It was a lot of fun. And obviously that was really the start of BSB, which is now obviously Bennett's BSB. So that was kind of, 96 was kind of the official year one. Then Cadbury's decided they wanted to do something else in 99, which came as a little bit of a shock. We were just launching the new R7. And we got a call through a contact through Virgin Limo Bikes. We got a call from Richard Branson's office. In fact, me and Neil Mackenzie were in Jerez, and we got this call to say, we're going to sponsor you, because obviously you've got no sponsor at the moment, but you need to be at my house tomorrow in Oxford. And so me and Neil had to dash across Europe and get to his house so we could do this filming with Richard Branson to announce the sponsorship. So that first year, if you look at the 99 bike, it's just Virgin branding, whereas then it became Virgin Mobile, and we became part of a Virgin, more corporate thing, which lasted a number of years and into the R6 Cup. So I've been really fortunate because I've worked with some amazing people in my career, a lot of them involved with racing. You know, Neil Mackenzie, Rob McElnay, these guys are the best of the best, Grand Prix level superstars that rode those wild 2-strokes back in the day. They were wild times, and you know, everybody remembers the sort of the Sheen, James Hunt. You know, racing was on the edge. I think it was dangerous, and it's become safer and safer during the 90s and stuff. But that was kind of why it was a bit wild, because these guys were genuinely risking their lives. And you know, the paddock would let off steam when the racing was finished, shall we say. So there's some great stories and great times, and I feel really privileged to have worked with them. And it's really nice that we're still involved. So Neil Mackenzie did quite a lot of work with us last year when we launched the XSR 900 GP in Marlborough colours, like the one he rode. And he rode the prototype for us at Goodwood Festival of Speed. And we're still working with Jamie Whittam because we support his track school. So the racing thing has been amazing. It's been at the cutting edge. We've always had really good support from Yamaha. We've had like ex-factory help, and even now with the current teams, we get a lot of help through the GYTR program, and the factory development for the World Superbikes comes back to us in terms of parts and development bits and stuff. So, you know, our bikes, although the regulations are different, they are at a super high level now, because that's the level of competition in BSB.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in BSB, the R1 seems to be the bike to have. So for the last 4 or 5 years, it's, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a good package. It rewards the rider. It's forgiving on tyres. It kind of works everywhere. We're not necessarily always the fastest or the best, but somehow the window that it works in efficiently is really good. And we're very lucky to have a couple of top riders this year with Brad Ray and Carl Ride.
Ex-champions, of course.
Both.
So you've had Carl Ride, Bradley Ray, and Tara Mackenzie in the last 4 or 5 years, all win championships. Very competitive still as well this year.
Yeah. You know, and that's against competition. You know, if you think how dominant the Ducatis are in both superbike, they just haven't had that dominance in BSB. And you know, they've got a very good team. They've got a very good rider. But
and even from a development perspective, you know, the R1 is no longer available as a production bike, and it hasn't had the development that the other models have, and yet it's still the bike to beat.
Yeah, and I think that shows how good it was. I mean, it's now 10 years since we introduced the current generation, 2015. And it hasn't changed enormously over the basic bike hasn't changed enormously over those years. But I think it also reflects how good the BSB rules are in keeping the playing field level and trying to control the cost for riders. So, there's limited amount of time for testing and other things that are quite expensive. And that means that, in many respects, the R1's got a target on its back. That's the bike to always beat. But the lap times really in the last few years haven't changed too much. But I just get this feeling this year, I'm just seeing a few, the weather conditions have been great, but I'm also seeing, lap records now being pushed again. So we'll see where it goes in the future. But yeah, the R1 is now only available as a non-homologated track race bike.
But Yamaha's also been involved in kind of off-road experiential stuff. So I think you talk about the Whittam School, but Yamaha's had not necessarily as high profile as some of the other manufacturers' schools, but you've certainly been. I remember going on a Geraint Jones off-road school in 1996, 97-ish. So you've had that stuff going on at Yamaha for a long time.
Yeah, for us, it's quite an important part of the mix of what we offer is experiences and experiential things that customers can do. So the school you mentioned, the Yamaha Off-Road Experience in Wales, if you've never been, go. It is amazing. But it's a long-term partnership. It's over 30 years we've been working with those guys. It started off really as enduro training, and then that was opened up to customers who wanted to ride, and then it's taken another step in the last few years. We've developed with them a new welcome centre, so it's got all of the latest facilities. It's beautiful. They have an amazing area in the Hafren Forest where they ride, and they now do not only enduro-based WR rides, but Tenere. So Tenere experience is built into that. And a lot of people going down there. We supply the Teneres, so they have a fleet. You can go down there and ride. And again, coming back to it, it's off-road riding is really good for your road skills as well. So that school is just amazing. Whittam we support with Bikes for the Instructors, so he runs a track training. So again, it's low numbers, and you can go there and get some real coaching and help in terms of your riding and your style and how you sit on the bike and what you do and so forth.
So it's not a track day, is it? It's very different from a track day. It's much more.
Yeah, it's a lot more training involved. Then we also work with a guy called Jason Jumps, who runs the Yamaha Track Experience and does some of the Bennetts days with you guys. So he has a fleet of R9s at the moment. So if you can't get a ride in the shop, go and ride Jason's on a track and experience it in a really pure way. And that's super successful. We've been working with Jason for a number of years. And we also have an arrangement with the AMCA, the Amateur Motocross Association. So they run the Yamaha MX Experience, which is focused on our MX product. Again, mostly road riders, although they do take on training for off-road races. And you can go and ride a YZ125 and a YZ250 and on a motocross type environment, a short closed circuit. So we feel we've got quite a good mix of different things for people to go and try. Some of it is training, a lot of it's training based, but a lot of it is rider skills based.
I think arguably two of the biggest hurdles in UK motorcycling at the moment are the tapping into that trying to attract a younger crowd, and then also trying to improve rider standards. I mean, with all the things you just mentioned there, that's probably covers off that base. And also, one of the most popular models in your range is NMAX, isn't it? 125.
Yeah, NMAX is our best-selling two-wheeler currently, and it's very popular not only for the commercial guys like the delivery guys and so forth, but also as an all-round scooter. We have a bike called Razor R, which is a lower-cost entry-level scooter, 125. But the market that's kind of disappeared a little bit is that 50cc market that I grew up with. And I think people are coming to motorcycling perhaps a little later now. Having said that, Yamaha's always been really strong in 125. So we have an R125 mini version of that. We have an XSR 125 custom version, and we also have the MT125. So we have a really good choice of 125s. And I think still, whether you're 17 or older, you've still got to see that bike when you open the garage and be passionate about it. So having proper 125s, you know, they're physically a big size, and they obviously they're performance restricted in terms of the legislation for an A1 license. But if I was 17, I'd want an R125, no question, because you just look at it, and if that's your entry to motorcycling, so the product is there. And again, it's perhaps a little bit UK-centric that we're not getting those people in, because I've just been riding through France and Germany, and actually you do still see a lot of much younger people coming on. So there's all kinds of different socio-economic issues around getting into biking as well. Insurance, so you're insurance guys, so you'll know about, you know, the problems perhaps of getting insurance when you're younger or living in the central of a town and so forth. So it's a moving feast. But what all we can do really is make sure that the bikes we offer to those guys are bikes they really want to ride and really want to buy and really want to be on, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's in that thing you said about them being full-size bikes is important, because also those people who start riding slightly later in life, you forget how, if you're on a very small 125, often they're not easy to ride, and if they're not easy to ride, you won't pick up the skills. You won't, you know, and so actually they're not doing as much for you as a rider as they could. You know, I remember a mate of mine a long time ago who started riding later. Was quite a big guy, did his CBT, bought a 125, and it was horrendous. It was a tiny bike. It really struggled with it. Took it for his test, failed his test, and he ended up buying, I think it was a DT 125 in the end, because it was just physically a big bike, and he just felt much more comfortable and confident riding a big bike.
Yeah, my older daughter just did her full motorcycle license, and it kind of gave me an insight into just how challenging the test is, and that whole system of you know, you've got to ride a bike and you've got to practice on it, and then you go to a test. In my day was not so hard to pass. You had an examiner. I remember my bike test very well. You had an examiner on foot, and you left the test centre on your 250 with an L plate flapping on the front, and the examiners would say, right, well, I'm going to walk around the corner and I'm going to pop out and we're going to do the emergency stop. So I'm coming around the corner at about 23 miles an hour because I didn't have to go. And I can see him looking around this tree and thinking, okay, well, that's where we're going to be. So then he jumped out and stopped. And I stopped so far away from him that he had to sort of beckon me up to him. And if you could read a number plate at 50 yards, honestly, they gave you a license. Now, and it is a good thing, you know, there's a lot of training, and it's really a difficult test. And I think perhaps some people are apprehensive about it, and that's probably pushing them a little bit older. So in my day, you took your test if you could on your 17th birthday. Nowadays, it's probably a little bit later than that. And people are a little bit more settled in, you know, it might be their education or first jobs and so forth. So there's a socio change as well.
We talked a little bit about 125s, and Yamaha's model range is broad, but it seems to me that the natural evolution of the powered two-wheeler is going to be EV or hybrid or whatever it may become in years to come. But is 125 the area where Yamaha's looking at for its EV power? I know you've got an electric scooter, haven't you, available right now?
Yeah, we have an electric scooter, which is a 50cc equivalent. And there is work going on in Japan right now. There's been a couple of things online that have been shown very recently about testing with developing and testing hybrid bikes.
Yeah, I saw that.
And they have a scooter and a street bike and a sports bike. And of course, we also have to understand where the regulations will be when we bring future products and so forth. But it's also fair to say that the electric market, certainly in Europe, hasn't really taken off. There are probably other solutions. You know, it might be that it's different types of fuel and so forth. So I think it's still a very open playing field in terms of development, but we are developing hybrid if that is the way that the market is going to go. But I think at the moment, still the internal combustion engine is, while we can, it's the favoured preference for us. You know, we talked earlier about development coming from racing. Of course, that's really still the pinnacle of racing is you know, prototype four-stroke. So we'll see what happens with biofuels, with other technologies that come along, and legislation, and make bikes that people want to buy, that in their hearts they can look at them, that are thrilling, but are also practical, reliable, durable, affordable.
So those guys over in Japan, those product planners have got to have their fingers in lots of different pies right now, thinking about 5, 10, 20 years in the future, and also different markets, whether it's European or some of the big markets where you're selling big numbers, be it across the Far East. It's just interesting, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting because the legislation around it seems to have lumped motorcycles in with cars in terms of dates for where they want things to go all electric, and it appears to be, I'm not an engineer, but it appears that it's easier to build an electric car that satisfies the needs people have of a car than it is to build an electric bike that satisfies motorcyclists.
Yeah, I think things can be done, but can they be delivered to the market at an affordable price point? And that is the challenge, because you also have to occasionally put yourself in the rider, the customer's position, and to, would you buy that when that is still available? So it may be that choice is taken away through legislation, and then we'll have to meet it. But at the moment, right now, it's clear that customers still want a more, the traditional ICE engine, and we still have development plans for new models coming out over the next years with traditional engines, as does every manufacturer. And I guess everybody is in the same boat as us, that everyone's looking at, how, what, when and where.
Yeah. And, at some point, we keep reading stories, don't we, about battery technology and yeah.
Steve, you're writing the stories. You guys are the...
Yeah.
So we should be influencing, that's right.
Yeah. It does feel like at some point the stars will align, and that kind of holy trinity of price, performance and range, will appear. But at the same time, the motorcycle has always been, it's either been affordable transport, and the affordable part of that is the important bit, or it's been, even as a leisure thing, we talk about bike prices and how they've changed, but it's still it's an affordable, for the pleasure it gives and the freedom it gives and the impact it has on your life. Motorcycling is still a very affordable pastime, hobby, however we describe it.
Well, yeah, totally. And not only that, but we talked about the golden years of the 90s and the 80s in terms of product development and changes and so forth and so forth. But honestly speaking, the bikes now, they are fantastic. Not just our range of Yamahas, but they have actually not ridden in many cases at the same rate as inflation. No. And actually, today's rider has an amazing choice out there, and we have bikes that can just do everything. Like we talked about that Tracer 9, a GT. You press a few buttons and you take it from a tourer to a sports bike. We couldn't have even imagined that. You had to go and buy another bike. If you wanted a tourer, that's what you bought. And if you wanted a sports bike as well, you had to have another one. But so, actually the technology and the choice at the moment, honestly, it's just, they are the best they've ever been. They are sharks. They're at the top of their evolution curve, motorcycles. I really believe that.
Yeah. And we do forget that, because if you look at the R9 as a 900cc, 120 horsepower sports bike, if you were to put that next to, we talked about the Fireblade earlier, if you were to put that next to, a 900cc, roughly 120 horsepower Fireblade, that actually didn't cost that much less in 1992 than this costs now. And you ride them, to ride them back to back, I know, because when we ride old bikes now, we have that emotion and the nostalgia, but when you actually ride them now, they do feel slow and cumbersome, and the brakes are appalling in comparison. And you get on it and you ride a modern bike with that sharp response and that ability to tailor the performance and the electronics and the handling, and it's night and day.
Yeah, and it's not just the bike, it's the tyres and the brakes and the suspension and all that stuff. There's this constant improvement that everybody is doing, and the durability. I remember when I started, going to Europe on a tour. You better pack some spanners, because you were very likely going to be using them. But now, I've just been to Slovenia and back without touching anything.
Jeff, you talked about the breadth of options available to customers these days, and many of those options are now coming from China. There's a lot of Chinese manufacturers that we are starting to see in the UK. How concerned, does it give Yamaha opportunities to kind of benchmark, or is it a bit like the Japanese influence of the late 80s? How do you see it?
It's an interesting question. I think we mustn't be too UK-centric about looking at new manufacturers that are coming from wherever, China, wherever, because the UK market it's not the biggest in Europe. We're about number 5. France, Italy, Germany, Spain. So people aren't developing new bikes. New companies are not aiming specifically at UK. They'll be looking at Europe. So to sort of hark back on what happened to the UK bike industry it's interesting, but and I can see why you might draw a parallel, but I think when the Japanese came to Europe, it was a very different scenario because they came with new technology. They came and they put it on the line on the racetrack. You know, Yamaha's DNA has always been racing, and from Phil Reed to when you see riders like Agostini moving from traditional 4-stroke to 2-stroke and winning straight away, clearly that was the future. So they did their product proving on the racetrack in front of everybody, and that's a pretty risky strategy, a brave strategy. And I think a lot of the reasons that they were successful was not only the introduction of new technology and so forth, but it was perhaps complacency or lack of development of the incumbent old brands. So the door was open. That scenario is not the same as now, because now everybody, Yamaha especially, is pushing in terms of technology, the bikes, etc., etc. So the attack is coming more based on pricing, and they have to prove themselves. Anybody new coming to the market has to prove themselves in terms of not just pricing, but things like durability, resale value, dealer backup, all those kind of things which are actually part of buying. And I think, we're celebrating our 70th anniversary this year, Yamaha, and you really probably can't think of Yamaha in Europe very much before sort of late 60s, early 70s, and that sort of thing. So it takes a long time to show your commitment and how good that brand is. And when you start understanding the attention to detail of quality, which we talked about again, is that a new bike, I expect to be able to jump on any one of these and drive to southern Europe, have a holiday and drive home without touching anything. So, but that doesn't come free. You earn that, and you earn that reputation for reliability and durability and quality. So they have to still go through that cycle. And at the same time, we're not lifting our foot off the gas. We're bringing new product and so on and so forth. So I think you're always going to have a focus on something new coming at a low price point when it arrives. But what about next year or the year after? Are they going to keep that product coming? We'll see. And if you kind of compare the automotive section a little bit on that, it hasn't super happened in automotive, that you've seen a massive wave. There's Korean cars and so forth, which are certainly gaining market share. So we'll see. But honestly, for the rider, competition is healthier. More choice, more competition, pushing, if it pushes our engineers to give you something better next year, fantastic. So, we shouldn't be afraid of competition. It will always come. And the more successful you are, the longer you've been around, the more the competition will be aimed at you and your products. There will be, shall we say, a loose copy of perhaps something you've already made, or the niche that we're aiming that bike for is already created because other people are in it, be it a sports bike or whatever. Whereas, when the Japanese came to Europe, things like RDs, it was just, there was nothing else like it, So interesting to look back, but I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of what you're going to see going forward.
Yeah. Happy 70th in that case.
Thank you.
I must have missed the slice of cake. We have a question. We've a social media site that we've launched recently, sort of our own understanding, our own take on social media, called BikeClub. So find us, Bennett's Bike Club. And we've had a question in from a user there called Paul Jacques. I'll read this word for word. Why isn't there a large, and in brackets a litre plus, tourer/tall rounder in the Yamaha range? You seem to have stopped at 900cc.
Yeah, currently the range is CP3 for touring. And in fact, I own one. I've got an FJR 1300 in my garage and I love it. But the reason we stopped selling it and didn't develop it into Euro 5 Plus is that sales were very small. You have to look at where the volume is for the market. At the moment, we think the Tracer 9 GT Plus, and I've just driven to Slovenia and back on one last week, that's a pretty sweet spot for a tourer that also needs to be a sports bike. So, you know, I'll admit, on the motorway, I wouldn't have minded a bigger CC bike last week. When I got to the mountains, actually, that was spot on. So it depends what you want from a motorcycle, and not everybody can have everything. Obviously, we had 1000cc in the CP4 for MT10 and MT10 SP. So never say never, of course. But at the moment, we think the new GT Plus, and you guys haven't ridden it yet.
Yes.
It does everything a motorcycle could ever need. So
I look forward to the Tracer 10 then. Just a couple of quick fire questions really to round off, because I'm sure that our cameraman must be running out of tape at this rate. If you could click your fingers and your favourite ever bike that you've ridden, be it a track bike, off-roader, street bike, anything, if it could appear here right now and you can go and take it home.
Well, I was lucky enough to ride Jason O'Halloran's BSBR1 at Silverstone, and 5 laps was not enough. So I'll take that home tomorrow, thank you very much. and get because when you get a chance, and I rode a couple over the years. I rode Rob Mack's OW01 based Loctite bike at Donington, and those proper race bikes set up by the top guys, they're so far removed from what you and I ride. They're so sharp and they ride so differently, but you just need time on them to readjust you've got to put a different brain in. And what they can do on them at that level is amazing. So it would be that would be the bike I would be loading in the van.
Anything else, Steve?
I know, I've been fascinating, but I can't think of another question. I'm sure we will when we leave, but no, it's been really interesting.
I just want to end with a bit of an an industry one, only because, Jeff, over the years you've been at Yamaha, you've treated so many media to so many of your special press launches, and I could reel off half a dozen now of helicopter rides and shark. That thing we did in the MT10 in South Africa, looking for sharks on a fast. Anyway. Have you got anything that stands out? What's your favourite ever launch that you've hosted?
I'm glad you talked about launches, because it's a very small part of the job, but a very big part of the job. There aren't many launches, and I count myself as really lucky to be amongst the first people to try a new bike. It's such a privilege, and it's so exciting. I get excited about it because all these engineers and all these developers and everything is culminated in this one moment where finally everybody can test it internally, but finally this is the first time you give it to people to criticize and test and so forth. And it's such a big moment in the bike's life. So a press launch is, I'm sure people have heard lots of stories, but a press launch is that one moment in time where you let other people ride it. Because as soon as a bike's in the market or in the dealers, anybody can ride it anytime. You can go to a dealer. So this is controlled. We've chosen the best road that suits the bike. Hopefully the sun's out. It's my job in PR to make sure you guys have a wonderful time on the launch, partly just to show you that Yamaha appreciate you coming to ride it. And and the engineers especially are genuinely interested in the feedback we get from the journalists and what they write about it. Because that's the only way you can then improve. Because you don't build a bike to not be the best you can do. So if someone comes along and says, actually, I don't like the whatever it might be, you go away and you think, okay, we thought it was good, but he doesn't, so how can we make it better? So that you often see the next generation, 1 or 2 years down the line, some of your comments or criticisms will then be fixed. So a launch is a really special moment and very memorable, and I've done lots of them, plenty with you. What's the best launch? Gosh, I think that depends on many different things. Obviously, if it's a super sport bike, riding on the circuits when you feel like a factory rider, the bikes come off the tyre warmers and everything's ready to go, and you have a lovely sofa to sit on before the bike's wheeled out and it's fueled and the tyres are done, and all the stuff you have to do on a track day is done for you. So that's always special. MT10 SP in South Africa that you mentioned, that was pretty special.
Some wonderful roads around there.
It was incredible. I think, we've been super lucky in terms of going to all these wonderful places. I still think probably the highlight would have been something like the R1 original launch in '98. We went to Cartagena, and that was as much about the bike, because it was so high level compared to anything else. I took Neil Mackenzie on that launch. He was double British champion already, so he was at the top of his game. And I remember saying to Neil, he said, well, what do you want me to do, Jeff? I said, just PR-y stuff, but actually what I want you to do, and these guys are so skilled, I said, I want you to go around and ride that with the journalists at race pace. Full on, super bike, race pace. And the journalists, they're all very good riders, but they're not superbike world level riders. So he said, are you sure? Because I'm going to be kind of overtaking them a lot. I said, I want you to show these guys what this bike can really do. And he was coming onto the start-finish straight, front wheel in the air, crossed up, leaving a big black line, through 3 journalists, into the next corner. And he came back and said, was that the sort of thing you had in mind? I said, spot on. So it's those little memories, working with those guys, that make press launches even more special. But I think, I've been super lucky to do lots. Enjoyed doing a few with you. And it's been a lot of fun over the years.
Fab, thank you very much for your time.
Big pleasure.
And I'm sure we could have used up plenty more of his tape as well, talking about all sorts of stuff from the past and the future as well. Thank you, Steve. Right, do go and get your motorbike insurance from Bennetts. It is the best, and they pay me to say that, but I'd say that anyway. And you also get, as a result, you can get free access to BikeSocial membership, where you can get over 200 different discounts and offers and fantastic opportunities to come and experience, track days for one. Come and find us on our Facebook. We've got a private group there. You come and join us, ask any questions you want. We've got all sorts of experts also there who can answer your questions. That's the Bennetts BikeSocial Facebook group. And also, I've mentioned it, but BikeClub as well. Thanks again. See you next time.